Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. Time to begin our regular Halacha shiur. This is WebYeshiva.org, and we're talking about head covering. In the first half of the series, we dealt with women's head covering. Now, in our final session, we're completing our discussion of men's head covering. What we've learned up till this point is that there's a diversity of opinion, a spectrum of opinion. Well, I suppose that could be said about just about everything. In halacha. There's a spectrum of opinion. The mainstream view, which we saw, held that men's covering of the head with a kippah or whatever is a midat hasidut. Let's get that spelled correctly on chat. Midat hasidut, an act of piety, that men cover their head, an act of piety above and beyond what is required by halacha. And we also saw the other opinions according to the minority view, according to which men are obligated to cover their head. Now, let's pick up with new material. What about special circumstances? For example, if you are in prayer, in tefillah, saying brachot, learning Torah, uttering God's name for whatever reason, well, it has to be good reason to use God's name, or else you're guilty of using God's name in vain. But assuming you have a good reason, namely you're praising God, thanking God, requesting God to do something, then it's correct to use God's name in that situation. Does your head have to be covered for that? Let's see the approach of the Igros Moshe. We know Rabbi Moshe Feinstein very well by now. He says as follows: Lahazkir Shem God. That's in English. To mention the name God, G-O-D, in English. Do you need your head covered for that? Of course, he wrote this in New York, so the example he gives is English. But of course, the same problem occurs exactly with all other languages aside from Hebrew. Is there any kedusha? Is there any sanctity in God's names in other languages? Now, think about it for a moment. Everyone knows that there are certain mitzvot which you have to fulfill in Hebrew. For example, Birkat Kohanim. When the Kohanim bless the people, the text they use has to be exactly the same as the 3 verses in the Torah, which give the formula for the blessing of the Kohanim for the people. After all, it says in the Torah, Ko Tivarchu. This is the way the Kohanim bless the people. So they have to use that text in Hebrew, and translations are no good for that mitzvah. On the other hand, there are other mitzvot, like Kriyat Shema, reading Shema Yisrael, which if you have a good translation in another language, that's acceptable. But what about situations in which you want to say Shema Yisrael in English, and God's name, Hebrew is very rich in God's names. There are many names for God in Hebrew, and you have to translate a name of God into a target language where you're doing Shema Yisrael or studying Torah or whatever. Now, names, according to many poskim, cannot be translated. If someone's name is Moshe, that is his name. His name is not Moses. His name is Moshe. And therefore, even if you are translating an entire text referring to someone whose name is Moshe, and you're translating the text from Hebrew into English, the name Moshe must remain Moshe. His name is not Moses. If someone's name is Shlomo, his name is Shlomo and not Solomon. And therefore, names cannot be translated. Well, since names cannot be translated, it follows that the holy names of God in Hebrew are names of God, and therefore cannot actually be translated. And therefore, the English word God G-O-D, is, from the halachic point of view, not an acceptable translation of the Hebrew Elokim. If you're reading Shema Yisrael and the three paragraphs of Shema Yisrael and God's name appears, you can't translate it as G-O-D. Names are names. Well, to say G-O-D, God, ba'anglit, in English, or in any other language, whatever it is, shehu hakavanah al Hashem Yisborach begilui rosh, mentioning God's name in another language aside from Hebrew with gilui rosh, with head uncovered. What's the halacha? Are you allowed to do that? Nireh, it seems she'ein lahakpid kol kach. You don't have to worry so much. It's okay. Since covering the head is midah chasidut, since covering the head is midah chasidut, an act of piety in general. So of course, it's an act of piety to cover your head when you say G-O-D, God, in English, but it's not really necessary. Ein lahakpid kol kach. You don't have to be so careful about this one. If your head's uncovered, when you say God, G-O-D, you don't have to get upset about that. Why? Shach is one of the two principal commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, outside margin, in every standard edition of the Shulchan Aruch. The Shach wrote, Belosh Nechol, in secular languages, Yiddish, Russian, he wrote the Polish, he wrote this in Poland in the 17th century, in other languages, not the holy language, not Hebrew, Kamo Got, that's the old Yiddish word for God, Got. Eino Shem Klal, that's not a holy name at all. The Shach wrote, Mutar lemochako. If you have a piece of paper and God's name, it says some religious piece of paper, and it says G-O-D on the piece of paper, there's no objection to erasing that. We know that a piece of paper which has God's name on it, the paper acquires some kedusha, the paper acquires some sanctity, and well, you can't throw it in the rubbish. You can't efface the name of God. That's if it's in Hebrew. But if it's a translation into some other language, G-O-D, no particular kedusha, no particular sanctity in G-O-D, God, and therefore, if for some reason you want to erase it, if for some reason you want to efface it, God, the Shach says no problem at all. Now, this, of course, is not a universal opinion. There are rabbis like the Chayotim who disagree with this. Yeah, well, the 70 languages which you mentioned on chat, this deserves a special discussion. Well, I'm not going to get into the 70 languages now. Being a linguist by profession, I'm retired now. But having had a career as a professional linguist, I'm very interested in the question of 70 languages. But that's a subject for another discussion. The bottom line, according to the Shach, there is no sanctity in G-O-D, and therefore no problem in erasing it. Not everyone agrees with this. Not everyone agrees with this, but we'll come to other opinions later. V'hu pashut etzlo kol kach. This idea is so obvious to the Shach. This idea is so obvious to the Shach that there's no kedusha, no sanctity in God's name in other languages. The idea is so obvious for him. Ad she'amar b'lashon, and the Shach used the following words to express his opinion. Haga atzmecha, taha mutar lemchok shem shenichtav b'lashon chol. He used the words, it's obvious that if you have God's name written in another language, G-O-D, of course you're allowed to erase it, efface it, toss it in the rubbish, whatever. Of course there's no kedusha. L'da'ato, rak l'chadchilo yesh le'zaher. According to the Shach, of course it would be correct midas chasidus. It would be a correct act of piety not to throw the paper out. Of course that would be correct. But really, there's no particular prohibition. Okay, so now we understand a number of important things. Number one, in the background, we understand that there's a big machloket, a big disagreement out there about whether or not God's names in other languages have any kedusha to them. The Shach holds there is no kedusha, no sanctity, and that's the opinion embraced by the Igros Moshe. That's the opinion embraced by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. According to this, if you have a newspaper, a book, anything in English or any other language than Hebrew, and it has God's name in it, that's not a reason to require putting it in the Geniza. It can just be tossed in the rubbish when you're done with it. We'll see other opinions later, but that's the opinion of the Shach, and that's the opinion embraced by the Igros Moshe, and therefore, as far as mentioning God's name in English or any other language aside Hebrew is concerned, it would be correct and nice to cover your head, but that's always true for men. If you don't cover your head, there's really no reason to get excited about that. That's the position of the Igros Moshe. Now, let's take this idea one step further. We're about to look at a tshuva written by Rav Dovid Hoffman. Rav Dovid Hoffman was the Rosh Yeshiva in Berlin, 19th century Rosh Yeshiva in Berlin, and back in those days, he was the greatest of the rabbis, the greatest of the poskim in Germany, and he's particularly important in the history of halacha because modern times arrived in Germany before modernity arrived in Eastern Europe. In Germany in those days, they already had indoor plumbing. In Germany in those days, they already had electricity. In Germany those days, they already had a stock market. All the appurtenances of modern times already existed in Germany. While in Poland and in Lithuania and Russia, in Eastern Europe, they were still living without running water, without electricity, surely without automobiles. They were still living basically in the Middle Ages. Modern times had not yet arrived in Eastern Europe, and therefore the great rabbis of Eastern Europe had vanishingly little concern with modern things. What about electricity on Shabbos? What about the stock market, in financial law, and so on and so on? These questions first arose in Germany, and the tshuvas, which Rav Dovid Hoffman wrote about modern things, whether it's electricity or the stock market or food chemistry, these tshuvas paved the way, which subsequent generations of rabbis in general followed when they were later confronted with these issues. But he was the first of the great rabbis to be confronted with a host of issues having to do with modern times. In any event, let's see what he has to say about our issue. The question they asked him is, I Rashai, is it permissible, Lishava, to take an oath? Is it permissible to swear an oath, ba'arkaot shalahem, in their courts? You're called as a witness in a German court. You're called as a witness in a German court, and before you give your testimony in the non-Jewish court, they want you to swear in the name of God that you're going to tell the truth. Are you allowed to do that, begilui rosh, with your head uncovered? Now, of course, the oath was going to be in German. Now, this was in Germany, but the whole point is that mentioning God's name in an oath, you swear to God that the testimony you're about to give is true. Are you allowed to pronounce that oath, mentioning God's name with your head uncovered? That's the question. Let's see the answer. Ine, behold. And this is a very powerful answer. The first time I saw this tshuva was years ago when I bought a copy of the Melamed Lahoil. That's the name of the sefer. When I bought a copy of this sefer, and before I began reading the sefer, I thumbed through it, and I could not help but notice when I bought the sefer that one pages in the Sefer were blank white, just blank white. That attracted my attention. And I saw that an entire tshuva was missing. There was tshuva number 55, and following it was tshuva number 57, and there's a big white space in between. Tshuva number 56, which we're about to look at, was completely omitted from the book. And, well, you know, like being as cynical as I am, I, of course, wondered... Oh, you can't hear me. Okay, let me check what's going on. I am not muted. I'm okay. I should be broadcasting. Does anyone else have difficulty hearing me? Others can hear. Okay, so it's not my fault. So of course I went to the National Library here in Jerusalem, and I got a first edition of the book, which had this tshuva number 56, and I photocopied it. And, well, this tshuva has been suppressed, omitted, censored, eliminated, blocked out in the more recent editions of his tshuvas. I am not very happy with censorship. In any event, let's see what it is that he said that some reprinters of the Sefer found so offensive. Here goes. B'kehila HaKedosha, in the holy community, Yereim de Frankfurt, the mine, in the holy Jewish community in Frankfurt, in Germany. But he was in Berlin. He was in Berlin, but in Frankfurt, in the holy community, B'veit HaChinuch, in the Jewish school, Shenitya said, Mehagon Rab Shimshon Raphael Hirsch Zatzal, in the Jewish school in Frankfurt, which was founded by the great Rabbi Hirsch. Rabbi Hirsch was one of the all-time great leaders of Orthodoxy in Europe back in the 19th century. He was one of the main forces in preserving Torah Judaism back in those days. And he founded a school, primary school, secondary school in Frankfurt for the education of the Jewish children. In that school, Sha'ani Hayiti Moreh Sham Shtei Shanim V'Chetzi. Full disclosure, Rabbi Hoffman says, I was a teacher in that school. When I was young, I was a teacher in that school. I had a job there for 2.5 years teaching Gemara. You know, like he's writing this when he's a mature scholar in the Rosh Yeshiva in Berlin. But when I was younger, before I became the Rosh Yeshiva in Berlin, I had a job there for 2.5 years teaching Gemara. So I know all about the school from firsthand experience. And in that school, which was the leading school for Torah education among the Orthodox communities in Germany, in that school, Yoshvim HaTalmidim, the male students, the boys, this is from kindergarten through high school, 12 years of education, the boys in that school, B'shas Limud Sharmadaim, when they were learning other subjects, secular subjects, not Gemara, not Chumash, not Halacha, when they were studying history, mathematics, grammar, when they were in their secular study classes, B'friyat Rosh, the rule was they had to uncover their head. Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who created the school, established a firm and fast rule that the boys are required to have kippot. They are required to cover their head in holy studies, limudei kodesh, Chumash, Gemara, and so forth and so on. And the boys are required to uncover their heads in secular subjects like history and mathematics and so forth and so on, because Rav Hirsch wanted that the children in the school should have a clear understanding of the difference between what is holy and what is secular, and therefore he introduced this rule that for Kodesh, you cover your head. For whole secular studies, the boys were required to uncover their heads. Rak Beshat Limud Torah Mechasim Rosham. The boys had to cover their heads only when they were studying Kodesh. V'cheinu minhag b'Beit Sefer b'Hamburg. This is true not only in the Orthodox school in Frankfurt, it's also true in the Orthodox school in Hamburg. You know, the great rabbi of Hamburg in those days was Rav Bamberger. And he and Rav Hirsch disagreed about many things. They were at loggerheads about many things. On the other hand, they also agreed about many things. They got along well. They worked together, but they disagreed about a lot, although they were friendly. But in the school in Hamburg, which followed the policies of Rav Bamberger, the great opponent of Rav Hirsch, in the Orthodox school in Hamburg, they also had exactly the same policy: boys' heads covered for Kodesh, uncovered for secular subjects. Okay, now that is all very interesting, and I'm beginning to understand why the recent reprinters of the Sefer were unhappy with this tshuva and chose to censor it. Let's go one step further. Of course, this was the policy introduced by Rabbi Hirsch himself. And now our author, Rav Hoffman, Rav Dovid C. Hoffman, the Rosh Yeshiva in Berlin, comes to tell a personal anecdote that he remembers from his youth when he was applying for the job to get the job as a teacher of Gemara in that school. Of course, you couldn't get the job without an interview by the principal. The principal of the school was Rabbi Hirsch himself. It was his school, and you had to get an interview. You had to be interviewed by Rav Hirsch in order to get the job. So how did it work? The Pam Rishon, the first time, Shabbati Leveto, the first time I came to Rabbi Hirsch's house for the interview because I wanted to get the job as a teacher in his school, I came to the house of Harav HaGaon, Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. I came to the house, Bekova al Roshi. Of course, I had my hat on. I'm an Orthodox rabbi. I'm going to visit another Orthodox rabbi to get an interview to be a teacher in a school. Of course, I had my hat on. I walked in to his house. I was admitted into his house. Amarli, and the first words out of his mouth, the first thing he says to me, the first thing that Rabbi Hirsch said to me, Kan hu derech eretz, here, if you want to be polite, lahasir hakova me'arosh, take the hat off your head. In my presence, you will be bareheaded, is what Rav Hirsch said to Rav Dovid C. Hoffman. Kishaba'im el adam chashuv, here, when you appear in the presence of an important person, you take your hat off. And you're coming to me for an interview for a job, you come with uncovered head. Why? Ulai yireh moreh acher. Maybe another teacher in the school will happen to come by. Maybe another teacher in the school will have a question for me. Maybe another teacher in the school will stop by. After all, yesh b'veit hachinuch sham gam harbe morim she'enam Yehudim. Many of the teachers in secular subjects were not Jewish. Many of the history teachers were not Jewish. The German grammar, literature teachers, many of them were not Jewish. Maybe one of them is going to come here for a consultation. Maybe one of them is going to come to ask me a question. I'm, after all, the principal of the school. She'ani eini mesir kova me al harosh lifnei rosh beit hachinuch. And if they see you with your hat on, in the presence of the principal of the school, they didn't use the word principal; they call him the director. If the non-Jewish teachers happen to see you standing in my presence with your head covered, hu hayam mechashev zeh ki'ilu ani mivazer oto. The non-Jewish thinkers would think that you have no respect for me, the non-Jewish teachers who see you with your hat on will think you are disrespecting me by keeping your hat on. As a sign of respect, hat off. Hat off. Yeah, how times change. Next semester, I want to give a course about why things change, but that's for the future. So not only was it a historical fact that in the school of Rabbi Hirsch, the leading Orthodox day school in Europe in those days, not only was it a historical fact that the boys were required to uncover their head in secular studies, but anyone who appeared in the presence of Rav Hirsch was required to take off his hat as well. That was a required sign of respect. In English, there's a common expression in English, hat in hand. To go to someone with hat in hand in English means to be modest, to be humble, right? To be modest, to be humble, to be respectful is an English expression, hat in hand, not on your head. And that was true not only in English society, that was true in throughout Europe, and that is what Rav Hirsch required. Well, he goes on and says that now that we have this background, we can approach the issue of the exact question that was asked. You're called as a witness in a non-Jewish court, and you have to swear an oath in the name of God that you will tell the truth. Well, you need a hat for that. You have to cover your head. There's no problem here in imitating Gentile ways. This deserves a whole series of classes in and of itself. What constitutes a violation of imitating Gentile ways? But one of the rules is that anything which you do out of kavod, a sign of respect, is rational. There's a reason why you are doing what you're doing, to express respect for someone, to honor someone, and any action which is rooted in reason. There's a rational reason why you are doing what you are doing. In this case, to express honor or respect for the person. That's not a violation of imitating Gentile ways. Imkain, therefore, b'nidon didan, therefore, in our specific question of making an oath in the non-Jewish court, im hashofet noten reshut lechasot harosh b'shat hashvuah, if the judge is okay with your covering the head during the oath, if the judge has no objection, if the judge says, yeah, you can wear your hat for the oath, matov, that would be good. That would be good. Like as we've seen over and over again, the mainstream view of the poskim is that covering the head is an act of piety above and beyond what is required. But that's good. That's advisable. That's commendable. That's something we should recommend. And if it's possible, good, go for it. And if the judge has no problem with it, so of course cover your head for the oath in swearing in the name of God that you're going to tell the truth. Should ask the judge whether or not he's okay with covering the head. If the judge says go for it, fine, that's good. Cover your head for God's name. You can explain to the judge that since you're about to utter God's name and there's some holiness, some sanctity, not according to the Shach that we saw on the previous screen, but according to other poskim, there is some sanctity in God's name in other languages. Ashvuahu lo bilti safek devar kedusha, and according to other poskim, the oath mentioning God's name is indeed does indeed have an element of kedusha to it. So it would be good to cover your head if the judge allows it. But if the judge is unwilling to approve of head covering in his court, back in those days, there was no such thing as female judges. So I say, if the judge was unwilling to permit uncovering the head in his court, because we don't have to be gender neutral on that one. They didn't have female judges back then. There's no reason to suffer. There's no reason to be fined by the court. There's no reason that you should be found in contempt of court. Yachol l'shava, you can make the oath, afilu b'gilui rosh, with your head uncovered. It's okay to make the oath in God's name with your head uncovered. Of course it would be better to cover the head. Of course that's commendable, praiseworthy. Of course that's midas chasidus, an act of piety, but required? No. And therefore, there's no reason to run the risk of being found in contempt of court over this. Something which is truly prohibited. Well, if it's prohibited to say God's name with your head uncovered, well, you can't do. It's prohibited. But this is not truly prohibited, to mention God's name with your head uncovered. And remember, we're talking about God's name in other languages, not in Hebrew. One step further. Now, what about litzorech parnasah? What about uncovering your head because your livelihood depends on it? You can't get a job, can't hold a job if you're wearing a kippah all the time. Well, what if your livelihood depends on uncovering the head? In Israeli courts, they don't swear in the name of God. Yeah. Okay. Yes, we can smile at that. Okay, let's see what the Igros Moshe, what Rabbi Moshe Feinstein has to say about taking a job where you won't be able to get the job, won't be able to hold the job if you wear a kippah all the time. He was asked about a Torah observant man, shelo yitkabluhu b'makom avodah, he won't get the job. When he comes for his interview with the boss, applying for a job, he won't get the job if he has a kippah on. Well, can he go to the job interview without a kippah? These are the words of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in response. Even though the minig is more or less universal to cover the head, even though that's what Torah observant Jews do just about everywhere, even though that's a very firm and established minhag, even though that's the practice, lo garam minhagei Yisrael kedoshim. This is the covering of the head is not any more important than any other holy minhag of the Jewish people. Jewish people have tons of minhagim. A minhag is a practice above and beyond what halacha requires. And the Jewish people have tons of minhagim, tons of practices above and beyond what Torah actually requires, what halacha actually requires. And covering the head, no matter how important it may be, is no more important than any other minhag, which is above and beyond what halacha requires. V'adai lo adif me'aseh mamash. A minhag, including covering the head, is not more severe, cannot be more severe, cannot be more weighty than a real aseh, than a real commandment of the Torah. You always have to have in mind orders of priority, levels of priority. Some things are more important than others, and it's very important to know what's more important and what's less important. Commandments of the Torah are very important. Minhagim are less important. Why is it important? There are many reasons why it's terribly important to know the relative level of different halachot. prohibitions of the Torah. All prohibitions in the Torah come in many different levels. Some prohibitions of the Torah carry with them the death penalty. That's very severe. Other prohibitions of the Torah carry with them lesser penalties. Some prohibitions of the Torah have no particular penalty at all. You're not allowed to do it, but there's no particular punishment, at least not on this earth. And even those prohibitions of the Torah, which carry the death penalty, there are 4 different levels of death penalty. The Gemara really goes to town on discussing the 4 different levels of death penalties. All this is terribly, terribly important for many reasons. For example, what about someone who gets herself into the unfortunate situation that whatever you do, you're going to violate something in the Torah. Turn left, you'll violate this. Turn right, you'll violate something else. Stand still, you'll violate something else. You get yourself into a horrible situation where whatever you do is going to be a violation of something in the Torah. Well, you have to decide which violation are you going to do. And it's terribly important to know the relative levels of different commandments, the relative levels of different halachas and minhagim, so you'll know what's more severe and what's less severe. I'll give you a simple example you'll understand right away. Well, what about someone who has eaten a meat meal and is now in his or her waiting time, different minhagim. Some people wait 6 hours, some people wait 3 hours, some people wait into the 6th hour. Whatever your minhag is regarding the waiting time after meat, you're in your waiting time. You're not allowed to drink milk. You're not allowed to eat cheese at the moment because you're in your waiting time. And like me, you're probably scatterbrained, and you prepare yourself a cup of coffee with milk in it. You pronounce the blessing on the coffee, and as you're raising the cup of coffee to your lips, you remember, I'm in my waiting time. I'm not allowed to drink this. Now, whatever you do, you're going to be guilty of something. If you drink the coffee with the milk in it, you'll be guilty of violating your minhag. If you refrain from drinking the coffee, you'll be guilty of having said God's name in vain in a blessing. Now, using God's name in vain, that's a serious violation of the Torah. Given a choice between violating a minhag or violating a real prohibition of using God's name in vain, of course what you should do is take a sip of the coffee. And then with the milk. And then, rabbis will always disagree about everything. Rabbis will disagree about, well, if you already had to take 1 sip, can you continue drinking, or should you just be limited to 1 sip? This rabbis will disagree about. But my point is, given a choice between a major violation and a minor violation, of course, if you have no choice, you take the minor violation. That's pretty simple. No, you can't drink another beverage which you didn't have in mind at the time that you made the bracha shehakol. You make a bracha shehakol, bori pri eitz, bori pri adama, whatever the bracha you make is, the bracha covers only things which you had in mind when you made the bracha. But let's leave that discussion for a series of shiurim on blessings. In any event, the minhag of covering the head is less severe than real commandments of the Torah. And regarding real commandments of the Torah, lahefsed gadol enu mechuyav, we are not required to fulfill commandments of the Torah if it's going to be very expensive. There's a limit to how much money you have to pay in order to fulfill a mitzvah of the Torah. And rabbis, of course, disagree about how much money that is. But according to most opinions, the maximum that you can be required to pay for the fulfillment of a mitzvah is 20% of your net worth. If the mitzvah will cost more than 20% of your net worth, the Torah does not expect you to spend so much money to buy an esrog or whatever the mitzvah is. Okay, well, if real mitzvahs, if real mitzvahs do not require you to spend so much money, if expense is an exemption for fulfillment of real mitzvahs of the Torah, onus mammon hu onus lagabe mitzvahs, if the financial pressure, the onus is enough to exempt you from a real mitzvah of the Torah. And he says, take a look in Siman Tafresh Nun Vav in the Shulchan Aruch, where you'll see that the 20%, the homish, the 20% amount mentioned. Rabbis disagree about what the percentage is, but according to the Shulchan Aruch, it's 20% of your net worth. If buying mezuzahs will cost you more than 20% of your assets, you don't have to buy a mezuzah. There's a limit to what the Torah expects you to pay for a mitzvah. Of course, we're talking here about the fulfillment of a positive mitzvah, what the poskim call kum va'aseh. Let's get that spelled correctly on chat. Kum va'aseh, stand up and do. Mitzvahs which require you to do something actively. Mitzvahs which simply prohibit you from acting. Shev va'al ta'aseh. Prohibitions which expect you to just sit and do nothing, their cost is not an issue. You can't eat something which is prohibited. You can't do something which is prohibited. It doesn't matter what the financial loss might be. But mitzvahs which involve doing something, like putting a mezuzah on your door, there's a financial limit. Well, if the Torah does not expect you to suffer great financial loss to fulfill a real mitzvah of the Torah, imkain, therefore, kol shekain, all the more so, the gilui rosh she'eno aseh de Torah, all the more so, as far as covering the head is concerned, which is not a real commandment of the Torah, it's only a minhag, and therefore less severe, aflo aseh de rabbanan, it's not even a rabbinic requirement to cover the head, ella minhag tov, it's just a good minhag, onus mammon hu onus, financial pressure is surely enough to exempt you from covering the head if there's going to be financial loss. Getting a job, which is going to be your livelihood, who have said, Gadol, that not getting the job would be a major financial loss. You're there. The financial loss is going to be even greater than 20% of your net worth. This is the job that you hope to hold for a long time. Well, if covering your head is going to lead to major financial loss, ample. Getting the job or losing the job, even if it were a real mitzvah of the Torah, you would not be required to cover your head in that situation. All the more so for minhag ba'alma, all the more so for this lovely minhag. Well, it's not surprising, is it, that Rav Moshe Feinstein has embraced the mainstream approach of just about all the great poskim, that covering head is not a halachic requirement for men. It is a minhag tov, a very fine practice. It is midas chasidus, an act of piety. It is commendable. It's all kinds of good things, but not actually required. And therefore, these leniencies click into place. Now, let's take one other aspect of Rav Moshe Feinstein's thinking on this issue. What about Makom Chshad? You're putting yourself into well, let's see exactly the bad situation that he's talking about, and you'll be able to extrapolate from his precise examples yourself. Elu sheholchim l'makom. Torah-observant Jews who go to a place, she'osim inyanei pritzis, where acts of immodesty take place. Rikudim shel bachurim betulot biyachad. Torah-observant Jews who go to a place where boys and girls are dancing together. Go to a place where boys and girls are dancing together. He's talking about back in those days, what would be called back in those days a nightclub, a discotheque. Do those still exist in the modern world? I don't know. But you're going to a nightclub, to a discotheque. This is back in the 1950s, which is a place where boys and girls dance together. Yesh shegam hem atzmam ovrim al isa pritzazo, and maybe the otherwise Torah observant Jew is going to participate in the dancing. Maybe just going there and have a drink, or but maybe he's even going to participate in the dancing, or maybe he's just going to sit at the bar and have a drink. Doesn't matter. Even though in general this person is Torah observant and fully Torah observant, normally he wears a yarmulke, the Yiddish word for a kippah. Normally he's for bat. He's going to a bar. He's going to have a beer in the bar. Should he uncover his head when he's there? Should he go with or without his kippah? Should we tell them that, of course, we don't think you should go into the salon, but if you're going to the bar to have a beer, should we tell them at least don't wear your kippah? Is that what we should tell them? Kol shekain, all the more so. If you're not only going in to have a beer at the bar, if you're going to dance with the girls or with the boys, Yasir Yarmulke, should you take off your hat? Should you take off your kippah? Yelchu b'gilui rosh, should you go with uncovered head? Kedei shelo yomru haroim, so that people who see you will not say, Rikud kazeh mutar. People will not say, hey, he's from, hey, she's from, they're Torah observant, they're dancing in the nightclub, it must be okay. There's a kind of Morris Iron here, a kind of leading people astray. You are known as being Torah observant. You are seen in the nightclub, in the bar, in the discotheque, whatever it is. Maybe you even went to a performance of Handel's Messiah. The people see you there. They know you are Torah observant, so they will conclude, oh, this must be okay. This must be okay. He's from, she's from, they're doing it. No, it must be okay. Maybe you should avoid giving the impression that Torah observant people go to places like that. Yeah, making the bracha over the drink requires God's name in Hebrew. That has Kedusha. And the minimum requirement for covering the head we're going to come to in a moment. But yes, one has to cover the head for the bracha. Ramosha explains like this. Poshet. It's obvious. It's poshet. It's obvious, in my opinion. It's obvious that these young people are doing something wrong going to the nightclub. They're already doing something wrong. We shouldn't tell them to add another wrong thing. It's enough to doing one bad thing. We shouldn't tell them to do something else. We shouldn't tell the guys to uncover their heads. Afrak Isur Minhag, even though it's only a minhag, Hashuv, even though it's only an important minhag to cover the head, still, there is some reason to cover the head. It's an expression of modesty, that we're in the presence of God, in the presence of the Shekhinah, the divine presence. You can't recommend to someone to do something else wrong, an additional thing wrong, just because he or she is doing one thing wrong. Well, no. You should not go there without your kippah. Of course, you should wear your kippah. And there's a fundamental misunderstanding here in the question. The question contains a misunderstanding. De'im yod'im oto le'ish shomer Shabbos meniach tefillin u'mitpalel. If they know that he is Torah observant and he keeps Shabbos and he puts on tefillin and he davens in shul, people know that he's from Yush Holech Begilui Rosh, and they see him going with uncovered head in places like that, in the bar, in the nightclub, in the discotheque. People will see that. Yilmadu gam zeh she'ein lachush kisherotzim l'raked ushar inyinei pritzes gam l'kisui rosh. Though the people will conclude that it's also fine to go with uncovered head. You know, it's enough that you're giving the impression that being in that place is okay. Why should you also give the impression that uncovering your head is okay? No, one bad thing is enough. You shouldn't add more bad conduct to it. There's really no benefit to be gained by uncovering your head in a situation like this. Well, now, as you know, cynic that I am, I always get a little bit nervous when the poskim say that something is pashut, so obvious that it requires no proof and no source. And that's exactly what Rav Moshe Feinstein writes here. It's pashut. It's so obvious and so clear that he brings no source and he brings no proof. It just seems so clear and obvious to him that this is the halacha. And let's see if I can bring some support to what he's saying. I found a passage in the Sefer Hasidim. The Sefer Hasidim, that's not the modern Hasidim, the disciples and the followers of the Baal Shem Tov. These are the medieval Hasidim from Ashkenaz back in the 13th century, before the modern Hasidic movement was founded. The modern Hasidic movement began in the 17th century. The Hasidim of the Middle Ages wrote like this: Kishem shenichnas bekoshi b'chasiduto, just as it is difficult to rise in the ladder of piety, it's hard to live a life of greater kedusha. But as you ascend in the ladder of kedusha, it's hard to do. Once you've worked very hard to acquire a good characteristic, once you've worked very hard to embrace a new path of holiness, it's hard to abandon that path. Once you're on the straight and narrow, it's hard to abandon the path of the straight and narrow. Why? Because of shame and humiliation. Pen yomru abriot, lest the people say, people will say, he's a hypocrite. He was never sincere in leading a Torah observant life. He's a hypocrite. We see now that he's all just a big faker. Lignov das abrias, he just acted pious in order to fool us. But when they see that he leaves the straight and narrow path, they will humiliate him, and people don't want to be humiliated. People don't want to be ashamed, and therefore, once you're on the straight and narrow, it's hard to leave that path. There's more to this passage in the Sefer Hasidim. It says, if you dress like a pious person, that will help maintain your Torah observance. Because if you're dressed like a Torah observant person, you will be ashamed in public. You will be embarrassed to do something wrong, because people will see you and they'll say, he's a hypocrite. He dresses like a Torah observant person, but we see that he doesn't act like one. He never really meant it. He was just acting like a Torah observant person to fool us. Well, let's leave the question of drinking Coca-Cola in a non-kosher McDonald's for another time. uh, whether or not there's such a prohibition deserves a lot of discussion. So, in any event, we understand Rav Moshe Feinstein's approach, and his approach does have a source which he does not quote himself. I'm sure he knew about it, but for some reason he doesn't quote it in the Sefer Hasidim. The Sefer Hasidim is one of the major sources of Ashkenaz halacha. It's very influential in halacha. The final topic we want to address very quickly is what is the minimum requirement of covering the head, for example, for prayer, for saying God's name in Hebrew, or for general acts of piety. What's called a head covering? For example, can you wear a wig or a toupee? Is wearing a wig or a toupee satisfactory for covering the head? Prima Godim, 18th century Eastern Europe, Poland, says, if you're under pressure, if you're under pressure and you don't have anything else to cover your head with, you can cover your head with your hand. No kippah, only hand. If you have no other choice, that's okay. Peruk, the Yiddish word for a wig. Wig in English is just a shortened form of the older English word periwig. People don't say periwig anymore in English, but that used to be the word. Now people just say wig. Periwig comes from the French perruque, and perruque, the French word for wig, gave us the Yiddish word as well. Perruque is a wig. Peruk misarot. What about wearing a wig made out of human hair? People won't realize that you're wearing a wig. They'll think it's your natural hair, and therefore it's no good. Even though the hair, the stranger's hair, is sewed onto a cloth base, and your head is covered with the cloth base upon which the hairs are sewn, still, yesh maris ayin, it looks like you don't have your head covered, and that's no good. That's the opinion of the Prima Godim. The Art of Sechayim, written by the Malbim, 19th century Eastern Europe. Yechaser rosho b'chol davar afilu b'yado. It doesn't matter what you cover your head with, even use just your hand is sufficient. Afilu b'sa'arot shekorim paruk. Even a wig is considered covering. Oh, so the rabbis disagree. What else is new? We've never seen an example which is free of disagreement among the rabbis. According to the Prima Godim, wig is no good because it gives the impression that your head is uncovered. According to Prima Godim, according to Artus Chaim, the Malbim on the screen now, it is a covering, and that's enough. Ein shaykh b'zeh maris ayin. There's no problem of maris ayin here, and that is a fundamental disagreement. Well, bottom line is just using the hand enough. The poskim disagree. Is a wig sufficient? The poskim disagree. And if we're talking about a minhag ba'alma, of course, there's room for leniency in both of these cases. Now, with this, we come to the end of this series of shiurim about covering the head. In the next semester, in the WebYeshiva, I'm going to be giving a series of classes on Kol Isha, the singing voice of women, and I'm going to be giving a series of classes on tzitzit, the mitzvah for men, and the question of whether women are allowed to fulfill the mitzvah of wearing a talit, tzitzit. That'll be in my classes in the next semester of the WebYeshiva. Until then, I wish you a Shavua Tov and eventually a Shabbat Shalom, and look forward to seeing you all again in the next semester of the WebYeshiva.